Well, let's take a trip over to Doha, Tom, where Qatar is reeling right now after an Israeli strike on Hamas leadership. What happened?
Yeah, so the Israelis launched a strike on the Hamas essentially negotiating compound in Doha in Qatar, which is, has been the kind of gatehouse, as it were, for diplomacy in relation to, releasing the Israeli hostages and suspending Israeli military operations, the idea of a broader ceasefire. But we've seen this strike. The President Trump has just come out and sort of suggested, albeit through intermediaries, I think the White House press secretary, that he is not happy about it, which would suggest that he was not either informed in advance or gave his approval. And there has been, it's relatively early, so we can't be sure about everything, but there's been some reporting that the Israelis told the US once they'd launched, which would be the kind of lowest level they would do. They would never do this without saying, oh, we've done something. I think what'll be really interesting here is the White House has made a big push in recent days for this new offer of a deal for Hamas, and they said the Israelis had accepted it, that now it's up to Hamas, and they do this or they die, very strong language from President Trump. But if Prime Minister Netanyahu has launched this attack without the White House's approval, without President Trump's approval, it has the potential to be a pretty big blow up between the two countries, because obviously it disincentivizes in a fundamental way Hamas is, already, I think, unreliable, but, willingness to engage in serious final status diplomacy. And secondly, it reinforces that idea that perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu is more beholden to elements in his government, his coalition government, that want a perpetuation of this conflict rather than a sort of messy, but as I think most Israelis would agree, realistic, peace accord. But it's a significant bilateral issue, and it's obviously a significant issue for Qatar because now, and Hamas, that,
an American ally.
The US military headquarters for the Middle East is based in Qatar. And so a lot of moving parts here, if nothing else, another example of the unpredictability that Israel's security strategy has sort of thrived upon, that you don't, as with the pagers and Hezbollah, unpredictability is part of their strategic calculus.
Mm-hmm. Is it that they don't trust U.S. intelligence or U.S. channels?
This strike particularly, you mean?
In general?
Well, I think there's, both U.S.
Has that been broke? Has that relationship been...
No, I mean, it's a strong relationship, but it's never, the U.S., UK or Australian intelligence relationships are far more trusting than the U.S. and Israeli ones because there are more naturally aligned interests, natural cooperation in terms of embedded teams. And whereas with the Israelis and the US, there are some, they conduct quite a lot of espionage against one another. I think in this case, though, look, I mean, the only strategic conclusion is that the Israelis have given up in the short term, or frankly, medium term, on trying to get some kind of peace settlement with Hamas. Otherwise, you wouldn't, lob a missile into their negotiating headquarters. I mean, there's some pretty...
Witkoff is
you can't confuse
right now.
that message, right?
I mean, but that's why it's just such a middle finger to the Trump administration if this is true, because they're literally going through
if it is, right. And again, this
right
early
now.
reporting, Trump may come out later on and say, oh, actually, no, I did like this because of X, Y, and Z. But it doesn't seem like that's the case.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty big gamble from Prime Minister Netanyahu in a condition where there was, as you have written about, already declining support for Israel on the right. It's very, very bold.
Also the American middle. I mean, independence.
Right.
It's crash of independence.
And again, look, there were people in that building who were almost certainly directly responsible for October 7th. But, morality, should not necessarily drive strategy. It should inform strategy, but it's not, getting revenge at this moment obviously has a lot of second and third order effects in terms of the diplomacy,
right.
Israeli security interests with the United States. So it's sort of a strange thing for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do, but a very interesting story out of the blue.
And it's less strange. I mean, it's still irksome when we're talking about Joe Biden and Rafah, which is recalled by all of this. It's, I mean, even more strange when you do it to a man who is notoriously sensitive about personal insults, personal relationships, and particularly in this case. So again, that's assuming this was true, that the heads up was only given after the strike was launched. But if that does turn out to be the case, is this a new chapter in the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, or is it just a more sort of obvious or a more visible manifestation of what's been a push and pull all along?
I think it's a new chapter. It's pretty clear, and I've heard this from including some very, very high-up sources, that the president has never had a particularly fond relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And again, as you say, the president may perceive this as a personal betrayal of trust, and also a betrayal of trust that has the counterpart of a betrayal of his, diplomacy, right? Peace diplomacy as Trump's, golden egg. Watch this space, I think, would be the operative, line.
Well, and that's the last question I was going to ask you, and it's a big one. But since Donald Trump was inaugurated and there was that temporary ceasefire reached, really because, as Blinken basically admitted, because of the incoming Trump administration's push for a ceasefire, the help of Steve Witkoff at the time, for example, and Trump himself, this feels like since that time, peace has never been less attainable. Like this feels like the sort of dead end almost. And I felt that actually before this strike, but I know the ongoing negotiations, they seem to get really close, and that happens over and over again, and then everything falls apart. Tom, it just at this point doesn't feel like there's any real end in sight.
No, but again, an extension of this. I mean, part of that, right, is Netanyahu's coalition, that there are elements that manifestly do not want a peace deal.
And the Israeli public.
And the
Israeli
Israeli
it's in
public,
a different place than the American public.
But I think the Israeli public generally would want a peace deal now that saw the hostages released, that it made some hard concessions. At the same time, Hamas doesn't want to give up its weapons. It doesn't want to
give up the hostages.
It doesn't want to give up the hostages. It's obviously mistreated them terribly. So there's a lot of anger. I just think, though, that Israel's options here become diminishing, at least in a battlefield sense, because of the practicalities, both diplomatically in terms of very poor relations, potentially including with the United States now, of major urban warfare again, but also, the exhaustion of their reserve forces and the exhaustion of the Israeli public. So where we go from here, again, watch this space.
They have recently called up a ton of reserves, right?
Yeah, but they're all exhausted. The best units are exhausted. It's a very small country, and you got a lot of people and that's fighting in dense urban environments. Where there are bombs. Under. I mean, it's psychologically and physically extremely draining. And Netanyahu knows that, and the chief of the general staff of the Israeli military has been saying, "Can we get a deal here?" Basically, because I don't want to exhaust my troops. Because what happens? The week after tomorrow, you need people in readiness for other contingencies.
Right. Well, and part of the demands, as I understand it, that are on the table right now in peace negotiations is that Hamas would need to surrender the hostages immediately. All of the remaining hostages immediately. Right. So from their negotiating standpoint, they say, well, that's all of the leverage, which is a disgusting way to think about human beings. But yes.
But a strange thing then that Israel would launch this attack on Doha, that kind of when such a put up or face the consequences deal was being considered by Hamas, at least.
Right.
So, yeah.
Great point. Tom Rogan is an editor over at the Washington Examiner, also a foreign policy writer. If you couldn't tell from this conversation, he covers foreign policy, and you should all go check out his work over at thewashingtonexaminer.com. It's been a pleasure to have you here in Undercurrents, Tom.
Thank you, Emily. I had a great time.
As a reminder, make sure to subscribe over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show, and of course on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts as well. And we will see you back with more soon.